Hi everyone and welcome back to sil201 Intermediate Silhouette Effects. My name is Ben Brownlee and welcome to week 2. So this is the footage we're going to be looking at this week, and the job we've got in front of us is there needs to be some more effects going on in the car in the background here. So our job this week is to roto the boy out as he passes across the car, so that other artists can come in and put in the extra effects. So let's take a look at this one. Let's zoom in just a little bit. And let's set this to swing again. So we've got a couple of interesting little points that we're going to be really focusing on. The first one is the motion blur going on. That's probably the biggest one there, how we start to handle motion blur. And the other one is sort of continuing on from the idea of tracking that we had last week. So where do we put our trackers? How do we most efficiently use them? And sort of how we start to recycle a lot of the trackers through again. So let's get to it. Now let's come and do our traffic light system here. So we stop, take a look at the footage back and forth a few times and see where the real sort of problem areas are going to be. And obviously, we're only going to really want to start from actually around about frame 36, maybe frame 34, just where it's passing over this area of the car here. So let's set up our work range there. So now we're just going and isolating the area from frame 34 to about frame 73 there. So this just lets us concentrate on the important areas. Now, how we're going to start to break this down, we've got some, let's come to an area where we can see the most complex region, where he's in focus at least. So it's probably fairly towards the end, yeah, frame 69 here. So we've got quite a few arrows going on in this quiver down here, as well as the bow that's swinging about on his back. Now, when it comes to the lad himself, he's actually fairly static. I mean, he's moving around quite a bit in the frame, but if you notice, the actual position of his body is fairly static. There's a little bit of drift as he moves from left to right, but there's no kind of huge movement going on, which is good news for us. It makes things a lot easier. So it probably means that the most successful strategy here for getting a good roto is to stabilize him out, or at least his core movement out, and then work our way from there. So let's start to do that. Let's create my first shape up here, and we're going to call this boy. Actually, we'll just call this boy to begin with, and we'll break it up afterwards. Cool. So I need that shape there because I need to now come into the tracker and we'll start to track him through. So let's find the best place to track, which is probably one of the only parts where he's in focus, because a whole load of motion blur going on, probably around about here. And I do want a core track. So what I'm looking for here is, I would say, his face moves around a little bit and he sort of bobs his head up and down a little bit. So the core track's probably going to be this area here. So let's come back to where that's in focus. There we go, and just alt-click. Come into my point tracker and just alt-click here. Let's make this a feature a little bit bigger so we get a bit of that shape there. The kind of black leather bit on the strap, which is going to be quite nice to track. Let's take a quick check through the color channel, see which one's going to be best. Red's looking clearly better there. So it's a toss-up between red and luminance. Red won out. Let's see if bringing up the contrast helps. Doesn't really. We will add a bit of blur to this because there's quite a large amount of grain going on, which is going to make tracking a little bit tricky. And then after we've blurred it up, we'll maybe just add a bit of sharpness as well, just to really define those edges quite nicely. And just denoise just for the sake of it. See if that helps. Let's take this to the start frame. The shape itself is going to be pretty static, so start frame is going to give us a good point of reference. Track through a couple of frames, looking good. Let's track through the whole thing. Track a couple of frames backwards. Track the whole thing backwards. So it's quite cool. We've got, using the Z and X actually to move us through, we've got a pretty stable area there, including the motion blur. As we go through the motion blur there, that still stays nice and stable for us, so I'm happy with that. Let's get on and apply this to our boy. Come back to our transform mode and let's just stabilize this up, see what's happened. Yeah, that's nice and stable now. So it's cool. We can actually now start to really identify the problem areas that we're going to get. So there's going to be a whole load of motion blur going on around about this midsection here. And it focuses back up again. Cool. Well, let's start with the easy bits. We don't have to break this guy up into too many different shapes. For a start, we're only really interested in the sort of top half of him now. We don't really need to worry about the legs or anything. So that takes a whole load of time out. So let's look at the head first. And let's just try and make a fairly quick and rough shape here. Now, I'm going to be quite loose at the bottom here and quite firm on the sides there. Now, this could be a bit worrying. Let's just turn the overlays off here. So we've got this brow ridge going on here. And if he was moving his head more than he actually is, that could cause us a little bit of grief. But you see, the thing is, he's not actually turning his head too much, so that's pretty cool. That's going to be fine. So let's turn my overlays back on. Bring these back in. Now, when it comes to motion blur, and I think I said this last week, there's a couple of schools of thought of where we land up on the motion blur, whether we're going to roto to the hard edge or all the way out to the edge here, to the past the soft edge where we can't see things anymore. Now, I'm of the school of thought that likes to actually roto to the hard edge, because personally I find it easier to come in and blur things outwards and sort of get that nice little fade off rather than have to think about, finding that middle ground or that proper outside edge, which can be a little bit elusive when things start to fade into each other. Now, I've left a couple of strands of the hair up here and we'll deal with those a little bit later. Cool, so let's come in and check out the main motion. It's probably going to be there, so let's come back to my transform here. Come in, move this to the again to the hard edge. Now, wherever possible, I always transform shapes instead of points, simply because I'm going to add fewer keyframes this way. I'm going to keep the shape in a much more sort of manageable way as well, and the movement will be, again, much more sort of natural. So as long as this main shape isn't moving or changing in any way, then transforming with the transform tool, and if you hold down the Alt key, you can come in and distort it as well. I find that doing that gives me a much better or much cleaner transition between the keyframes. I'm going to come in here and rename X-Spline 2 to just to head there. Cool, and let's find, again, looking for that natural motion there. So come in here, look for that hard edge again. Now, I don't think the boy's head has actually shrunk too much. A lot of that is just down to the motion blur. So on this keyframe here, I'm not going to do any sort of moving into the hard edge quite yet. We'll do that a little bit later when everything sort of starts to settle down a bit. come in, and here I can probably just start to bring that in a little bit more. Use the distort. Now because his head has turned a little bit here, the shape of the hair is one of the things that's also now changed. So I'm going to come to my reshape tool here and just reshape on a control point basis. So I always try to work with that sort of hierarchy. So we work with the big shape, overall shape here. So if I hit R now to go back to our reshape, I can come in and select a number of different points here. And if I go back to the transform here, actually double click on it or hit T twice, I'm now starting to be able to transform the sub object here. So I'm able to transform a number of points within that main group, and hit T again and go back to the main shape. So that can be exceedingly useful when trying to sort of work out an edge and just sort of keep an edge going on. If I can also avoid rotating and just use the distortion as well, and it makes sense to do that. So you've got something like the head moving around like it is here. You know, the shape itself isn't rotating, not in a Z rotation sort of way. So it makes no sense to be coming in and actually rotating the shape up. It makes much more sense to try and distort that out and see what mileage we can get from that. Let's take the stabilize off, turn our alpha on, take the overlays off, just have a little look at that. So what I'm checking now for is any sort of movement that's completely out of the ordinary or just looks a little bit ridiculous. Only thing here is probably at the first keyframe here I've missed out a load of the head. So that back hair there is starting to fade into the tyre here. So that can actually be quite tricky to spot. Cool, let's come in. Turn our overlays off again, just have a little look through at that. So that's starting to look all right. Now I'm not too, at the moment I'm not too concerned with the fact that the bottom part of the shape here is kind of distorting out a little bit, simply because we're going to come in here and, you know, fill in this area anyway. So it's really the edge that I'm much more concerned about. Let's see what sort of difference the motion blur comes in and plays on that. So let's come to about frame 50. So we can see this is probably where the motion blur is at its peak, at its apex, at its worst. Let's come in and turn motion blur on this shape. And we don't see a difference. We have to come back into the node, of course, come in here, enable motion blur at the node shape there. So here's probably a good time where I'd want to change myself to a different view. And let's have a look at the composite view. Turn my alpha off a little bit there. Just start to focus on this to see if we've got anything of the background sort of bleeding through. Here's not looking too great because I know we want to bring some of this out a little bit now. Stabilize it up again. Because that's cool. We can still get the effect of the motion blur even though it's all stabilized up. If I hit the numbers 1 through to, or 5 in this case, I can start to easily switch through my views. So toggling between those views there. See, I probably want to get rid of some of this area out here. So as long as I keep a consistent line, that's looking a little bit dodgy because it's bringing something in and then taking it out again. If I keep a consistent line, then it doesn't matter if we eat in a little bit of the head here. As long as it's consistent, the rotor is not going to look weird. But if we don't have that consistent line, actually I might come to... And let's just see what I can distort out of that. Yeah, if we don't have that consistent line, then things are going to start looking a little bit weird. So we've enabled motion blur now, and we've got a few different options that we've got. We've got shutter angle, shutter phase, and samples. So if I turn my shutter angle up, this is going to start to extend out the motion blur and make it even blurrier. And if you notice what's happening here is it seems to be pushing it out further into the movement of the shape into the future. And actually at the moment that's really not what we want to do on this particular bit of footage. So the way to get it back centered again is to have the shutter phase. Let's set this to 300 so we can see this quite clearly. It's quite a large shutter angle there. So we set the shutter phase to minus half of the shutter angle. This means that our motion blur is now sat directly in the middle of the movement. If we take the shutter phase all the way back here, you can see it's starting at the front edge and blurring all the way backwards. And if we take it to the other side, we can see it's starting at the back edge here and blurring all the way forwards. So if we have made a slight miscalculation in where we've placed our hard edge, this is where we can start to compensate for that. So if you have decided to come in and rotate towards the center of the motion blur, you know, we can start to come in and play around with this shutter angle and the shutter phase so that all the motion blur looks exactly right. If you want things completely centered, you want to have you don't want to have lagging motion blur or forward motion blur, then having the shutter phase set to exactly half or minus half the shutter angle is the way forward. Now you tend to find that the default shutter angle of 180 and shutter phase of minus 90 will be the right one, depending on the footage, of course. But usually, if it's being shot in a sort of standard way, then that's where we're going to be. That's where we're going to be landing. But here, I'm going to just give it a little bit extra, maybe 230 there. And if it's 230, I need that at minus 115. Sounds about right. So we can start to look at these on different backgrounds as well. So you could, for example, start to look at the composite with, you know, maybe a sort of rough track of what the effect is going to look like. In other cases, and something that I quite like doing is coming in, let's import some media. And I've got some grads here. These are just still images saved out as TIFF files. And these are quite screaming colors here. So let's look at maybe come into our inputs here, go to our background, and we'll choose the yellow-blue grad here. And we can't see anything at the moment because it's only one frame long. So if we come down to into our node list here, we get a list of all of our footage that we're using. Come into my grad TIFF here, just come into the node there and go extend duration, and this will then stretch that footage out across the entire range for me. So I can have a little look there, which is kind of nice. Let's look at the background, going to the pink yellow grad instead. Come over here, extend the duration out one more time, back to our roto node. So you can see now, you know, these are actually really big, bright colors that you're not going to miss. So this can help to sort of make that separation that you need to get between the background and the foreground, and see if there's any sort of obvious areas of foreground sort of slipping in. Cool. All right. Let's take a look now at, let's come back into our output mode here. Let's take a look now at our arrows over here. So our quiver full of arrows over here, and let's see what we can do with this. So again, let's stabilize this all up. Select the buoy, of course, stabilize that up there. Now the cool thing is about having this stabilized quiver now, or this stabilized footage now, is that we can really identify, if I play this back, we can really identify the main core movement that's going on within our quiver full of arrows. So it's basically taken out the movement of the buoy from the equation. So let's find a good place to set us up here. Now, because I'm going to be creating a whole load of shapes for these arrows here, I probably don't want to have them in the same shape as the buoy here. So we're going to sort of start to clean up the hierarchy a little bit here. Now I could come in and add another shape directly into the buoy layer here and call this quiver. But the unfortunate thing about that is that when we go to stabilize stuff up, it only stabilizes from the active layer. So that's not helping us too much. And if we come in and go to our tracker again, let's select our main tracker and the quiver here, just by holding down the Control or Command key, and let's go apply on that. Hit that there, come back to the main view here. That all seems kind of stabilized out, but now let's head to full screen again, F to full screen. But now our layer's already having a whole load of movement placed on it. So we can't actually come in and draw, let's just draw a really quick shape on that. So we can't even draw a quick shape on that, because what's happening is we've got the matrix applied to our main buoy layer here, and now it's being doubled because we've also got the matrix applied to our quiver layer here. So we can't get that sort of granular where we can sort of start nesting shapes within shapes and still be able to maintain that that nice stabilization. So if I want to take that out, I'm going to just bring the quiver out into its own area here. And now you can see that that's just following along with just one of those tracking things there. And if I hold down the stabilize again, it's stabilizing out that footage again as it should do. Cool. All right, so let's come in and actually start to make up a couple of objects on this. It's actually quite an interesting little shape here, because yeah, it's motion blurring out quite a large amount. Good amount of positive space going on right here. So we've got just this big block of arrows going in. I think actually even this up here, it's difficult to see it, but I'm wondering whether this bit here is actually solid as well. It looks like it, yeah. It looks like all of this area here is just complete solid, and we've only got just a tiny amount of space coming in there. So it might be actually worthwhile coming in and creating just one large big block for this area here, and then just taking out a smaller area. So let's see how that's going to work. So let's come in and do that. Let's make this shape up. Now this isn't going to be the simplest shape, I don't think, simply because it's a rigid object here. So what I'm tempted to do is actually spend a bit of time and get a slightly more complex shape going on, and just rotate most of this as one edge, just because the actual overall shape of this isn't going to be changing all that much. If this was a soft shape where things were flowing down, then I wouldn't even think of doing this. I'm extending this out quite a fair amount past where I actually need to. Let's check out the overlay on that. Let's just bring that in a little bit more. Cool. All right. So let's see how this is starting to move. So we can see already, and actually what I will want to do here is also take out this little area here. So let's come in, take an X spline again, and just, it's quite soft, this area. So we're going to have to come and do a bit of work with it afterwards, possibly. Cool. Now, at the moment, let's name these up. Let's call these arrows. At the moment, this shape here is actually adding still to the overall arrow shape. So if I just click on that blend mode over there, we can switch between how these start to blend together. And I'll take take that to a minus, and we'll call this arrow hole. There we go. Cool. And let's look at how this is going to start to move. This is actually a perfect time for where you really want to start to see that animation and start to work with it and sort of natural movement. Now going back to the transform area here, and let's just match up this point over here. Now if I come in, I can actually start to lock this now to either do transform, scale, or rotation. Because at the moment I can start to scale things up just using the outer corners of the edges here. I can rotate things around by holding down the Command key on the Mac, Control key on Windows, and I'm to distort things with the Alt, of course. But if I want to rotate around a specific point, a specific anchor point, I'm going to need to go into my quick modes. And the quick modes are Q for translate, W for rotation, and E for scale. And I hit on those again, then it takes me back to my main transform. So I'm going to come to where I want my anchor point to be, which is around this area here. Hit W for rotation, and then I can just, a bit easier, come in and start to rotate this around. Take us out of quick, mask there, and make the final small changes. I'm also going to change the colour of the arrow hole here so I can see it a bit easier. Take that to something a bit more contrasting, which is the yellow. Bring that in. Just rotate that around. Cool. Now again, there can be a sort of preference to whether you want to take one shape and work it all the way through, and then come back and take the next shape and work that all the way through as well. The reason that I'm actually moving between the shapes as much as I am here is simply because I know that pretty much these are going to be moving, or I'm going to need to add keyframes at the same time. So, you know, I might as well save a bit of time now and actually just do that while I'm here. So I'm looking for the point where it stops doing any sort of movement. So that's that point of main, or of absolute, so the point of most difference, really. And let's come in, let's rotate around from here this time. That seems to be working out a bit nicer, because it's actually finding the anchor point is probably around about, well, it's close to the body anyway, isn't it? I'm going to take the overall overlay down to about 10%, so I can probably see it a bit better. Actually, I might even turn that off for for the moment, especially while I'm trying to deal with this hole here. So we're static about there. And this kind of mess of motion blur, it does start to get a little bit tricky. And this area here is just one big splotch of motion blur. So I'm going to see how this starts to pan out when we've actually turned the motion blur on and we've done a few more keyframes to see whether I actually have to come in and do some control point manipulation. Which is by far my least favourite thing to do. Simply because it actually does take a lot more time to do it. And if you get it wrong and you have to redo it, you have to redo a whole load of stuff. Because you've added that many more keyframes. So the nice thing about this here is that we can just, most of the motion of this is actually translation and rotation. So there's hardly any distortion going on. I might need to scale this down a little bit, or distort this down a little bit. Just shrink it in. And see here, I've actually got quite a bit of trouble going on with the arrows over here. Because they're still not quite sitting right. We've got one of these feathers. It's actually definitely not sitting right. This little feather over here is obviously blown off in the wind a little bit. So we are going to have to come into the reshape tool and take this section here, then come back into the transform, hit that T twice, or come into the transform twice, and then just take that sub object in there, and I've obviously picked up one that I didn't want to pick up. So I don't even think that I can properly transform myself out of this one. So I'm going to come back into the reshape tool now. Just do this bit by hand. And if this gets too bad, probably a smart thing to do would just be sort of cut your losses and start again. Actually, maybe even just going into the multi-frame tool and simplifying out the object a bit more. So simplify out the arrows there, taking off those feathers, and then adding in a separate shape later for the feather itself. But for now, we'll crack on, see how far we can get with it. So I see here, and actually the feather itself started to disappear off all the way back down here. So it's good there, and we've got bad keyframes going from frame 34 to frame 53 to frame 59. So with those three keyframes, I'm going to have to come in and start to reshape all of those, which is why hopefully I wish I'd have caught it earlier, of course. But one of the big reasons why I can, if at all possible, to stay away from doing that kind of really sort of granular control point editing. We just start getting tons of keyframes where we don't want them. So I've opened up a whole Pandora's box here. We've got that whole edge is just fairly dodgy from quite a way back. I'm sure some of this is actually motion blur, so we can get away with some of this. Let's check it out. Let's turn the motion blur on. Come to my filter here. Let's take a look at it with the composite mode. So we're taking in that background that we had before, or that we set before. And you can see it's sort of blending its way through. Now, sometimes it's difficult to know whether we're going to get away with something until we actually see it properly in context, but we can start to shrink in that matte if we need to. So we do have a little bit of the background coming in here. So we can start to shrink in that matte just a tiny bit, a bit later if we need to. I'm just going to finish that quiver off quickly. Cool. So there's the arrows starting to take shape. And as you see, even with the stabilization, we have had to add in quite a lot of keyframes coming in here, just because the movement themselves, or the movement itself, because the movement itself is actually quite a complex one, because we've got, you know, obviously the motion of the bike and the motion of the boy going up and down, and the quiver itself sort of just vibrating off of the back there. So the same basic premise goes for the actual bow itself here. Let's come in and we'll do one for the bow. Bring that below the boy. Cool. We'll do the same thing with the tracker and apply that there. So basically just keep reusing that same track that we got. So it's really important that we get that track right in the first place. So the basic premise for the bow is the same as for the quiver. I mean, even more so when I'm actually let's just do that. Let's find a nice little area there. Just come in, turn the overlays on, of course, to bring up this. So when finding the shape for the bow here, I would try and extend this out quite a lot, just to find, or see if we can find the sort of main overall shape, because at some point it might poke out. In this case, it actually doesn't poke out in anywhere that's important, but it will help us to sort of try and get that overall kind of rotation going on with the arrow. So let's call it like that. So there we go. Let's take our overlays back down to 10% again. And yeah, we've got stabilize turned on. So let's come in, T for transform, W for rotation. Bring that in there. Just, you know, always remember to turn the quick mode off after you've worked with it, otherwise you're going to get a little bit frustrated. I should say increasingly frustrated as you continually forget to turn it off at different points. Don't worry, that's natural. You will remember to turn it off eventually. Cool. Let's just we'll keyframe up this just a little bit. I don't want to do too much on this because it's actually the wire here that I'm more interested in, and we are going to be looking much more in depth at wire removals in a later class. But it's so the basic premise for wires sort of holds true here as well. So we'll just do a little bit of that. So that's the main bow, and let's take a look at the wire itself. Now, depending on how we're going to be delivering this shot, or the result of this shot, it very much depends on how we can tackle this particular problem. So one of the nice features of Silhouette FX is the fact that we can have open splines. And this is actually really cool for things like hair strands and wires. So if I come in and just create a fairly basic shape here, just with three points on it here, hit escape. We've now got my B-spline here. Let's call this my what's the little stringy bit on the bow called? Oh, probably a bowstring. There we go. Let's call it. There we go. String. Cool. I hope that's the right name for it. And what we can do now is come up to our stroke width here, and we can actually stroke our open shape up. If we let's turn the overlays on, or let's turn the Rubylith on a bit more, and turn the overlays off. So we can start to stroke this up a little bit more. And this is really cool for thin little parts like hair and like this little bowstring here. Now, the only problem in doing it this way is that when we come to export the shape out to our compositing program, out to shapes, if we're not rendering it here and we want to render it, for example, to nuke shapes, we can't do that. Only Silhouette shapes can support our open splines. So that can be a bit of a problem if we want to take shapes out to nuke or fusion or flame. So in this case, it's safer to come in and create a small yet significant. Let's turn my overlays back on. And for this case, I'm going to be using a Bezier spline. Create a very simple close shape. So let's come in and make this nice. And the cool thing about this, let's actually take our overlays off again. Yeah, the cool thing about once we've got our little wire string thing here done correctly is we probably won't have to distort this shape too much. Even when we get to the areas of quite significant motion blur, let's come over here and transform this up a little bit. Let's call this, what do we agree on? It was called the string, wasn't it? Yeah. And let's come in, transform this up. And this is going to get very difficult to see with the motion blur. So one of the things that we can do as well, something we haven't done yet, is check out the individual channels, the individual color channels here. Let's turn off my overlays there, because you can actually find that one of these color channels is going to give you a much better separation between the background and the item that you're wanting to roto at any given time. So here, the red channel is probably the weakest channel we've got. Green is not far behind it, just because the contrast between the background and the foreground is not great. Blue is probably the one that we're going to go for. It's at this point here as well that I would come in with my string and change the color of the string to something a little bit damper. Maybe not quite that damp, but actually something that's not screaming out at me too much. So I've got a bit of a bit of contrast going on, so I can see that edge there, but it's not distracting me too much from the main item that I'm looking for. So this really is a significant challenge. As at this point here, where we can't see the string at all, that what I'm doing is looking for other visual clues. So I'm looking for the bow here itself. So the bow is probably going to be, or the arrows, string, is going to be connected to the bow. So long as we can follow that movement, we're probably going to be in a good position. So it does get fairly tricky, and hopefully, let's turn our, click on the white there to turn all that back on. Hopefully once we motion blur all this out, we're going to get, just this big, let's look at the mask there, this big sort of soft area here, which is going to be really, really faint, and just give us the idea of something coming on. It's actually kind of cool in the compositing stage, is if we take this out as an individual shape rather than as part of the overall shape, it can be easier to actually just shine a solid color through that string, rather than taking in all the background as we would actually take in if we were to export this out as just a sort of RGB plus alpha channel from the original. Because if we do that, then all we're really going to get is a lot of this blue coming out. Let's take a look at our composite here. So we're going to get a bit more of the blue coming out, which is in the background. And of course, if there's something else that we've put in, another bit of CG that's come in between that, that's not going to read as realistic anymore. So good idea to keep the string as an individual shape for exporting out. Now I know we haven't finished our shot. This is quite a big shot to be tackling in 45 minutes. We have actually looked at a lot of the sort of core ideas behind getting this done. So we've made our cool little track with our tracker that we've also attached to our 3 different main elements or main groups, and we've started to look at how we start to deal with things like the motion blur and moving objects as whole shapes rather than coming in and playing around with the individual control points wherever possible. So I'm just going to leave that there for now, but I'd love to see what you guys are capable of, and looking forward to seeing you again in the forums. So thanks for now, and I'll see you soon.